Hi, good evening. It's Meir Weinstein with the Never Again live show. It's a pleasure to join everyone tonight. We're just going to give it a few moments for our friends and supporters to join us. I'm going to ask everyone who joins us, please share this with the various pages and groups that you're part of. We'll reach a lot more people. We'll have a stronger impact. Tonight, we're joined with two lawyers, two senior people with the Lawfare Project. Henry Shiner, who was with us last week, he's going to be giving us information tonight, more information on this critical issue about the BDS and efforts to demean the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And Gerard Fillety, who's a senior lawyer with the Lawfare Project, he's going to be joining us as well. And he's going to be telling us about the phenomenal work that he's involved with against the BDS. We're going to be giving some information. We have a little video to show, and also we're going to be talking about follow the money trail as well. This is going to be very fascinating. Let me just mention the Parsha. Every episode we have, every show we have, we always start off with a little quick, important Devar Torah, a recap from last Shabbat. And last Shabbat was very fascinating, Parshas Tetzaveh. And in this Parsha, we were talking about Aaron and his sons and the priesthood and what they're supposed to be wearing and the clothing, and just so vital, so important, the focus and of this Parsha and what they're preparing for in this Parsha is really an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. And one important issue that should never be overlooked in this Parsha, this is the only Parsha in the Torah where Moses is not mentioned. His name is not mentioned. And his name is not mentioned because he argued on behalf of the Jewish people at the episode of the golden calf that God said to Moses, I will replace them. I'll give you another people. And Moses argued for the Jewish people. Now, those who were heavily involved with the golden calf, absolutely, they got punished. There's no question about it. But the importance here is to focus on the qualities of a Jewish leader. A Jewish leader has to do the right thing. A Jewish leader, there's no ego in it for himself. He's not thinking about personal gain. If his name is not going to be in this Parsha or any Parsha for that matter, his goal is the ideal. That's what's important. What's important for a Jewish leader today is to be able to look himself in the mirror and know that he stands for the ultimate ideals of what is important for being a Jew, what the ideal is of the Torah, what we have to strive for, what the fight is all about, what the truth is all about, and never back down from that. Never do this for a pat on the back. Look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and just be honest with yourself whether you stand up for the right ideals. We have Jews, unfortunately, today. That there was the international, the ICC, International Criminal Court, they declared today that they're starting the process of going after Israel. And if you follow the Twitter account of B'Tselem and the New Israel Fund, they couldn't be happier. In fact, B'Tselem, they gave testimony, and they're a major grantee of the New Israel Fund. They made testimony for the International Criminal Court to go against Israel. They made testimony at the United Nations before the Security Council. These are Jews that are going after Israel, that want Israel to take the stand and to be found guilty. So when you think about Moses and the golden calf, you can imagine what some Jews were up to back then. It wasn't good. It wasn't pleasant at all. They have to be called out, but that doesn't mean that we call it quits for the rest of the Jewish people at all. No. We stand up for Israel. We stand up for the Jewish people. We stand up for the ideals. That's important today. That's important. We also have JSpace and J Street that made it clear the other day. They made statements that they're joining an effort calling on, get this, calling on the Biden administration to take steps against the Jewish National Fund. It's outrageous. We have a lot of work ahead of us. So as we're going to be talking about the BDS and their connections, there's solid connections with terrorist organizations, and they should have absolutely no legitimacy on campus, no legitimacy at all, no legitimacy in the streets of any city. We have the New Israel Fund, we have B'Tselem, et cetera, that are justifying their position. So right now, our doctor in the studio, if he could show a short video and he could explain a little bit the connections with the BDS and the BDS National Committee to terror groups. That's something that is very important to get out right now. And then we'll talk about the legalities as well.
يجب أن نهجم على كل يهودي متواجد في الكرة الأرضية ذبحا وقتلا بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Well, we're having some problems with video connection still, so let me just talk a little about this gentleman, and I could see if I can go and get a little better quality of the video a little later. But it's important to, who was just speaking is Hamad, who was appointed the Interior Minister of Hamas back in 2009. He then in 2009, the same year, offered a $1.4 million award for any Arab citizen of Israel who could kidnap, abduct, and bring in an Israeli soldier. In 2016, when there was some internal arrest and among the organizations, he joined the Palestinian Legislative Council. And then in 2018, he called for and urged a resumption of war against Israel. Now, remember, there was a war against Israel. It never stopped. So he's not calling for to resume it. He's just calling for an escalation. And then in 2019, he did videos of how important it is to him for his people to kill Jews, not only in Gaza or in the West Bank, not only Israel, but all over the entire world. What I find ironic in this entire presentation is back in 2010, when his 3-year-old daughter needed some emergency medical care because of a congenital heart problem, she went to an Israeli hospital. So, as always, there's the inherent irony. I'm going to talk a little bit now about just the connection of the money for terrorism. And if we start with just, if we take a group of progressive Americans who are donating to a very wide variety of causes, the question is, how does their money, with them either naively or intentionally, getting it where we really don't want it, which is those terror groups? So I'm going to kind of explain briefly how that happens and how it ends up going before the terror groups to all of these terrorist organizations. Well, you know, we start off with just BDS. Well, BDS is one of several groups that work together as progressive and liberal and all left-wing groups of people, and they've merged with Black Lives Matter. They've gotten together with Antifa, and the three of these groups together have done just wreaked havoc and raised so much money, which either with intent or with naivety ends up in hands even worse than they had planned. So the common denominator of all of these groups is the funding corporation, which is called ActBlue. So ActBlue is an American organization that enables left-leaning nonprofit candidates and progressive groups to raise money for individual donors. Specifically, it's only for left-wing groups. That's what it's designed for, and that's who uses it. Some examples include the donations that went to Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. They all get processed through ActBlue, which has raised over $8 billion since their inception. And then an example of how well they do is the week following the death of George Floyd. In that 1 week, JetBlue managed to get $20 million in donations. Now, where are the donations going? Well, they may think they're going to Black Lives Matter or to some bail funds or a variety of other things. But the bottom line is what we need to do is follow the money. So if we follow the money, we see it becomes a very convoluted system that's very difficult to follow, and that's with intent. The fact it's difficult to follow. You know, it starts from ActBlue. It goes through a variety of BDS labeled organizations, and then they give the information back to this whole circle of JetBlue. So say you're donating to George Floyd. Well, then you end up getting an email or a sponsored ad saying, give to BDS. Or they won't even say that. They'll say, help the poor, starving Palestinians. So the way that works is ActBlue will then go and contribute some money to the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. But if you get an email and you're naive and you see Palestinian campaign for academics, you think you're helping the education of these Palestinians. So again, either with malicious intent or by being naive, that money is going into the wrong hands. The PACBI is a founding member of the national and the Palestinian BDS committee. So once it gets into their hands, then from there it goes to this BDS movement with a cute little logo. And then from there, it goes all over the place. It has offices in varying parts of Palestine, a staff spread across 5 countries, and a network of international partners. Their main activities include campaigning with BDS activists locally and worldwide. So then what happens after it gets to that organization? Well, then it goes to the Palestinian BDS National Committee, which is basically goes to the Palestinian National Islamic Forces Coalition, which was started by Yasser Arafat and then led by Mr. Bugatti over here. And that's one picture of him. I prefer this photograph of him, though, when I'm kind of thinking about this gentleman. That's a better picture when he's arrested by the IDF. Well, it gets into those hands of Palestinian National Islamic Forces. And who do they oversee? This is just a short list of groups that have been affiliated with the Palestinian National Islamic Forces. And basically, it's the liberation movement. Just to show how extreme it is, Fatah was expelled from it for collaborating with the enemy, which means they probably had lunch with some Israeli. Again, moving along, where does it go from there? It gets spread across Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, PFLP-GC, and that's how this money from progressive liberal hands just circulates around until it ends up right over there. And that's my summary of how ActBlue works, again, either maliciously or naively, to get money from progressives eventually to finance terrorism. And that's all I have to say. Back to you in the studio, Meir.
Okay, well, maybe we could hear from Gerard, that's very involved legally against the BDS. You could talk about some of the work and efforts that he's been making.
Well, thank you. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with something about the ICC, because this is something that the Lawfare Project has been involved with. We filed observations arguing that the ICC has no jurisdiction over Israel, and we think that the decision to exert this jurisdiction is absolutely appalling. But in doing that work, you know, what we came across is, and this links to Hamas, the ICC prosecutor was having meetings with Hamas senior figures, with terrorists, to discuss how they were harmed by Israel when all Israel was doing was defending itself. So this shows you the extent of the collaboration and the reach of these terrorist groups. It's not just that they're getting money from U.S. organizations and funneling it into anti-Israel campus activities. They're also channeling their aggression to collaborate with the International Criminal Court and international groups to put pressure on Israel that should never be there in the first place. So it's really important to address where all of this money goes. It's not just about BDS and campus groups. All of these terrorists have their fingers in as many places as they can to exert maximum pressure on Israel and to do harm to the international Jewish community. So I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it's essential to follow the money. And that is where we get into the crux of it, because providing material support, which includes money but also services, to designated terrorist organizations is, in the United States as elsewhere, illegal. So this is a basis not just for the government to get involved, but for private litigants to sue, to go after the funding and the activists who are getting this money and channeling it to designated terrorist organizations. This is where, you know, we have been fighting to find where the money is coming from and where it's going. And I will tell you, it's not an easy thing, because groups like ActBlue, they're not transparent at all about how they link money, where it actually goes. So you have some inconspicuous organizations with some beneficial sounding names, but people don't know who's on the board of those organizations. Where are they headquartered? Where are they actually operating? All of these are things that need to be discovered and identified so that we can act on them. It's not just a matter of the name of the organization, which is the top line that's ever disclosed. It's about finding out who works for these organizations and who they're related to that's channeling that money into the terrorist organizations. And I think, unfortunately, we find that the money flows both ways. We have campus groups in the United States that we all understand to be funded by terrorist groups or by money that comes from the Middle East, from groups that fund nefarious purposes there. But it's extremely difficult to prove, because there's no transparency, there's no recording requirement that people are actually adhering to declare where this money is coming from or where it's going. And the flip side is, we've seen, for example, in Rutgers a few years back, student groups get together and try to raise money for benevolent charities that supposedly help refugees or impoverished people in the Middle East, but where those monies are going to are actually to terrorist organizations. We had this in 2001 in the US. We had something called the Holy Land Foundation, which I'm sure that a lot of your listeners are familiar with. And that's a typical example of how this funding works. It's channeling money raised by charities, by so-called charities in the US. It's funneling them for use by Hezbollah, by Hamas, by PFLP, by other groups who, pretend that it's for charitable purposes, but we all know where this money is going. So the essential and the fundamental thing is to follow, and when you follow the money, you can find a legal basis, under U.S. federal law, which prohibits material support to terrorists, to go after everyone involved in that chain, from the people who advocate to collect the money, to the banks that transfer it and hold it, to the entities that end up using it. But the first step, as always, as Dr. Breffman said, is following the money. That's the crucial thing.
There's an individual that was appointed to a key position by the Biden administration with national intelligence, who was a BDS leader on campus, I think in Georgetown, in fact, if I'm not mistaken. I think his last name is Beaton. And the BDS, these BDS organizations, they make it very clear their connections, that they're with the BDS National Committee, and as was illustrated, where the funding goes and how the structure is built and the composition of it. How does this happen, that a BDS leader gets such a position?
Well, how this happens is BDS has been legitimized on college campuses. Well, and to me, first of all, that is very shocking, because when I went to college, this does not exist. It absolutely did not exist. I went to New York University, which was very friendly and open to the Jewish community. A lot of students were Jews. And now we have BDS that's permeated academia. One of the directors of the Middle Eastern program there, Zachary Lockman, who I knew many years ago, has become one of the leaders in these movements in advocating especially for divestment from anything to do with Israeli people and companies. But how this happens is legitimacy. It's this concept that, since no one is paying attention, the concept that there is free speech and academic freedom to say what you want without caring about the consequences, or without reference to how this affects minority communities like the Jewish community. It's this notion that people can speak about boycotting in the same way that they did against South Africa and apartheid back in the 1980s and 90s, and they make it sound like this fantastic thing without actually listening to what these people who actually implement BDS and who actually want to divest are doing. The people, the students, the faculty who hear BDS, in their mind, they're hearing the same thing that they heard with South Africa. They don't realize that BDS is funding extermination of Jewish people. They don't realize that people who chant from the river to the sea, it's not just a catchy song, it calls for the eradication of Israel and the Jewish people. So first of all, there's no education. There's no concept for a lot of people that this is what BDS is about. They see this as this fanciful, good-natured, progressive idea without realizing that from the river to the sea means killing Jews. So on the one hand, it's the failure of education. It's the failure of people to actually stand up and say, no, this is what BDS is. It's not a good thing. It's an evil thing. And that goes hand in hand with this misplaced notion that any speech on campus can be free speech. In part, that's correct. But the problem here is when that speech, when the notion that BDS is good, and when you have students chanting from the river to the sea in front of Jewish students or confronting them in this Israeli apartheid week BS that we see year after year, and when we see Palestinian protesters staging die-ins on campus, this adversely affects the Jewish community on campus. This is where we have legal issues. Because on the one hand, you can say things that other people don't like. But on the other, you can't say things to the extent that the people you're victimizing can't go to class, can't take final exams, can't benefit from their education experience the same way that other students can or the way they're supposed to. That's where we enter the realm of discrimination that's improper. So BDS, on the one hand, has been making inroads by falsely claiming to be this paragon of virtue. And on the other hand, by people not realizing and not wanting to enforce civil rights law that prevents campuses from, essentially not allowing Jewish students to get their education because of the antics and because of the harassment that they experience at the hands of BDS activists.
Another aspect to it as well. B'nai B'rith just made our community here, Toronto, aware of University of Toronto that the Islamic Studies program, they're having an event. It's coming up. I think it's tomorrow, in fact. An event where they're actually glorifying a convicted terrorist, so-called Palestinian terrorists, PFLP. Now, there's some Jewish leaders, they want to engage in Islamic Jewish dialogue, Muslim Jewish dialogue. And, on the surface, it's fine to try to get along with all groups. But if the bottom line is the Islamic Studies program is going to be promoting the BDS and is going to be putting on a pedestal a PFLP leader who committed terrorism, convicted of terrorism against Israel. What does this say for dialogue between communities? And what does this say about University of Toronto, that not only is it the Islamic Studies program promoting it, but using the letterhead and the logo of University of Toronto to promote it?
No, I think the latter part of that is the university is making it seem that this is their speech, that they are accepting this and promoting this as their ideal. And that must be terrifying to Jewish students or to any victims of terrorism, because you're seeing a university essentially condoning these acts by putting its name to it. That's disgusting. But the other part, and it's not Canadian law, but I think it's worthwhile quoting from a U.S. Supreme Court decision. That's Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project from a few years back. And I think there's language in here that is, equally applicable pretty much anywhere. The Supreme Court said that material support, and that is what this is when you're giving a platform to terrorists, when you're giving them the technology services to come and speak to students, to indoctrinate them, to convey their message. That's material support. And material support, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, is a valuable resource by definition, because such support frees up other resources within the terrorist organization that may be put to violent ends. It also importantly helps lend legitimacy to foreign terrorist groups, legitimacy that makes it easier for those groups to persist, to recruit members, and to raise funds, all of which facilitate more terrorist attacks. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem with hosting PFLP terrorists or anyone else of that nature. You are providing material support that's not just legitimizing those terrorist groups, but it's facilitating more terrorist attacks. And it's appalling that the university is putting its name to it and then making it look like it actually condones these actions. Now, free speech is an important concept. It's an essential concept to democracy. But there's a difference between speech and conduct. And putting together a seminar, a webinar, a presentation that's actually aiding these people, these terrorists, in getting their message out and recruiting and indoctrinating people, that crosses the line from speech into conduct, and that's conduct that, at least in the US, is regulated by statute and is illegal. So unfortunately, I am not a Canadian attorney, and I can't speak to the specifics of Canadian law on this. But what I can say is that in the US, what we've been doing at the Lawfare Project, and what we think is essential, is trying to hold the universities, the sponsors of these organizations, responsible for what they're doing, which is giving material support to terrorist organizations each and every time they invite someone like a PFLP terrorist to speak to students, to lecture them, to give them information about their activities. This is something that's illegal and unacceptable. And unfortunately, a lot of universities, they're not educated in the law. They think, they're bullied into thinking that this is an issue of so-called academic freedom, of allowing other people to be heard. Well, we don't allow terrorists to be heard when that message is basically indoctrinating people. It's giving the legitimacy to that terrorist organization. Now, if a terrorist wants to come and say that they renounce terrorism, that's different. They're not promoting it. But otherwise, what these people are doing is they're encouraging it. They're glorifying it. You know, I don't want to give credence to these people by speaking their names. We all know who you're talking about. But we don't want to create a cult of celebrity, which is what these people have. And that's the point. Every time that a university allows them to come on campus, remotely, in person, whatever, to speak, they're glorifying terrorism. They're basically supporting the idea that, hey, this is acceptable behavior, because if the University of Toronto has these people on, then it can't be all that bad. But that's not the case. The truth of the matter is that this is material support for a terrorist organization, and at least in the US, it's illegal.
If, let's say, the Islamic studies program at University of Toronto, all of a sudden they had something, let's move forward. Let's talk about the Abraham Accords. Let's see how Jews and Muslims could work together, bridge from what was in the past to now in the future. Let's have a war and peace. Let's move. But no, they are saying the Islamic studies program is BDS, is the worst of the worst, instead of let's move on and let's get along. Look at the size of the Middle East with little tiny Israel. It's just an embarrassment to even have to even defend Israel's right to exist when you have huge Arab countries. And it was the Arabs that started the war in 48 and wanted to commit a genocide against the Jewish people. And they haven't surrendered. They want Israel destroyed. And they are using this movement, the BDS, to spread that doctrine. And through the Islamic studies program of one example. But let me just sidetrack for a moment. Whoever is watching the show, I mean, please share this with the various groups and pages that you're part of. That's one thing, but also it's a phone-in. You can call in if you have any questions, comments. The phone number is 647-510-5535. It's on the screen. Call, no problem. We'll take your call and we'll take your comments, but we'll get back to it. So, so we have those issues. We have Al-Quds Day as well, and it's Iranian sponsored. They call for the eradication of Israel. They make it very clear. And, in Toronto, at least, we mobilized to confront it and have a counter protest. And I've spoken before at City Hall to really expose what the message is of Al-Quds Day, that yes, it is calling for a genocide of Israel and the Jewish people. It's amazing how the left, the radical left, tries to twist it into something else. So has the Lawfare Project taken some action also about Al-Quds Day and those who are behind it? That's a question for Gerard. Something happened with the connection. Technology. Whoever's watching, you could call the show 647-510-5535. Take your questions, take your comments. Also, we have Henry Shiner from the Lawfare Project, so we can hear from Henry. Oops, one moment. Now from our studio. Yes. Okay. Okay, so he'll be back. Okay. Okay. Very good. Yeah, so if Henry could come on and share some information about some of the work that the Lawfare Project's involved with against these efforts to spread really the doctrine of genocide against the Jewish people in Israel.
Sure. Well, so I'd like to, reframe the issue slightly and tie it back to the subject matter that we began to speak last week on last week's show, which is the issue of the title and sovereign legal rights that the Jewish people have in the context of international law. So, by the way, I just got a text from Gerard, and he says that his screen seems to be frozen, and it may have been kicked off. So, Dr. Gary, how do we get Gerard back on the platform?
Maybe he's got to refresh it.
So,
back here in the studio, yeah, what Gerard would need to do is go and just refresh, shut it down, and just turn it back on exactly like he did 40 minutes ago, and he should be just fine.
Okay. So hold on a second. Let me just
If
text
he needs anything, he can call me.
Yes, okay.
Perfect.
Sure. A second. Just texting him.
Yep. Well, let's see. We got some comments on the screen. In the meantime, I'm going to look at some of these. Volunteers to be heard. You're literally talking to someone accused of plotting to blow up a law. Far-right Jews terrify the common sense.
Okay.
Okay, so some guy makes a comment on our show. His name is Adam. Okay. You don't allow terrorists to be heard? Question mark. You're literally talking to someone accused of plotting to blow up a mosque. Really? You far-right Jews terrify the common sense ones. Yeah. Okay, Adam.
I'm not sure what he means by that, but
we're not too sure either. But
anyway,
maybe we'll show that video as well that we wanted to show from the start of the Hamas leader calling for the murder of Jews all over the world. Yeah, yes. Right. And Jews are blowing up mosques. Yeah, give me a break.
Yes. So
يجب أن نهجم على كل يهودي متواجد في الكرة الأرضية ذبحا وقتلا بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. يكفي تسخين خلاص. تسخيننا على آخر احنا اتفجرنا. وانت كل أبناء شعبنا جاهزين للتفجير. عملنا مصنع جديد إن شاء الله تعالى. بحالة دخول السلك جاهزين أخواتنا. كله أف جاهزات كلهن يحملنا أحزمة.
It's unbelievable. Yes, Henry.
Okay. So, so the if anybody ever studied the rules of deductive logic, which is, the foundation of deriving truth. Whenever in logic, you can have statements which are fundamentally false and logically true. In other words, there's a structure to logic, to truth or logic, and as long as you when you state a premise and you follow the rules of logic, if you follow the basic rules, you can make statements which are logically true. They're just fundamentally false. So, in order to really understand what is the BDS movement, is it a so there's the issue of how the so-called the Arabs who live in the state of Israel, who call themselves, they've rebranded themselves, they call themselves Palestinians. And so that these group of Arabs who call themselves Palestinians, they also have created a narrative by which they are the original indigenous people to the land of Palestine, Israel, and they're the ones who possess, because they're the indigenous people, they're the ones who possess sovereign rights, and it is the Western colonial enterprise that has denied the legitimate sovereign rights of the indigenous Palestinian people to the land of Palestine, which is the moral cause that they are championing. So none of that is true. But within their none of that is objectively and factually true. It's within their truth tree, if you will. Those are just premises that they've invented, and they've created arguments around it, and where they've been excellent at. They've been excellent diplomats, and they've been they've shown real cleverness in terms of their ability to take a complete fiction and translate that to political rights. They've managed to not on their own. They've had accomplices along the way, both intelligence organizations within Russia, the communist states, certain bad actors within the U.S. intelligence community, and for sure within the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you don't understand the actual cultural conflict between Islam as a world movement and the West, then you're going to completely miss the entire picture. And so, the roots of BDS, which the genesis is supposedly started with in South Africa in 2001 in Durban, when there was a peace. It was a UN conference whereby the BDS movement was launched, and they actually connected with the anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, and they co-linked. And this is where, if you look at the tactical strategies of the Muslim Brotherhood and why the Arabs have been such clever diplomats, is first of all that Islam does have its own developed worldview. It has, an ideology. It has, in history, they've built giant material empires. They've ruled, large parts of the world, and they've tied their roots, their spiritual legitimacy ties into, it's a replacement ideology for Sugula, for the nation of Israel, as per the covenant which is in the Torah. They see themselves as the perfection, so to speak, of the mission that Bnei Israel, Am Yisrael, undertook at Har Sinai, when there was Kabbalat Torah, when there was according to the Torah tradition and the tradition of Am Yisrael, Bnei Israel, when we received the Torah and we began to reintroduce Torah knowledge back into the collective psyche of mankind, and to perform all the spiritual obligations and all that the Torah encompasses. And that Islam came along 1,200 years plus after the fact, and said, the fact that the Jews no longer have, the Bnei Israel no longer have their temple, it's a sign of the abandonment of God, and he's severed the relationship, and that Muhammad is the new prophet, and that Islam is the new path, and this is the way that mankind is going to achieve final redemption. And if you delve into the fundamental tenets of Islam and their self-belief, there's a whole ideology, and I want to share with you a couple of key principles, because if you don't understand these principles of Islam, then you really wouldn't understand the tactics and strategy of BDS as an expression of these principles. So the Islamic world believes that it is their understanding of Allah, what we call Hashem, God, that they address God as, they call Allah. It's their relationship with Allah and their interpretation of it, which is the perfected understanding of that human divine relationship. And it's a fundamental tenet within Islam that they believe they have the obligation to make all mankind into Muslims. And they have an infinite time scale to achieve that objective. So fundamentally, like the Ayatollahs and their various proxies, Hamas, the PA, all the bad actors who are the terrorists, they're terrorists relative to the Western view of the world. Relative to their view of the world, they believe they're being tzaddikim. They believe they're being righteous, and they're purists, following the fidelity of the mandate that Islam has imposed on them. And what's that mandate? Is to literally conquer all of planet Earth and subdue it under Islamic law. Now, the notion of the political notion of a nation state, that is a Western political construct. In Islam, there is no such thing as the nation state per se within fundamental Islamic thought. There's only two categories of land in the world. There's something called Dar al-Islam, which are lands which are under the sovereign administration of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, which are lands which are under military conflict until they become Dar al-Islam, lands which are under Islamic sovereign administration. And if for some reason there is Allah in his infinite wisdom, and in addition to that, there's only three different categories of human beings according to Islamic thought. A perfected human being is a Muslim. That's if you want to be straight with God and be in God's good graces, you become a Muslim. You submit to the will of Allah. But because in the Quran they give a nod to Jesus and they give a nod to Moshe, so Jews and Christians within Islamic ideology have a special second-class status, and we're called a dhimmi. So under the organized community, so they don't have the nation state, they have something called the Ummah. The Ummah is the organized Islamic community, and it's all, Dar al-Islam is one region. All of the entire planet is one political sovereign region, and the Ummah is the administrative jurisdiction whereby Sharia law and Islam is practiced, and the tenets of Islam are openly expressed. And so there's a scenario whereby there is a loss of the administrative sovereign control of Dar al-Islam, Islamic lands and influence, because Allah in his great wisdom, his great mysterious wisdom, has somehow for some divine purpose, cause the Islamic community to lose sovereign control, then the Muslims believe that they have this holy mission to recover that land, which is Islamic land. Once a region of the planet has come under Islamic administration, that's it for eternity. It can never revert back. And if for some reason in the vicissitudes of history, they lose administrative control, then they get an extra mitzvah. There's an extra commandment from them, according to Sharia law, to wage jihad. And they literally have to go and fight, martially fight, to recover that geographic territory. And there's two ways to accomplish that. One is through a straight-on martial conflict. You go to war, you pick up your guns or your swords, and you kill your enemy. The other way is through diplomatic manipulation. And that's based on a treaty. It's called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And it's actually looked within Islamic law to wage jihad through diplomatic manipulation is a more meritorious way to recover Dar al-Islam. So once you understand the rules of the game, not from Western culture, in which we call it Judeo-Christian belief system, we have nation states, we have our church and state, all the institutions and beliefs of Western culture, and in a practical sense, since the mid-1600s. So when Islam first appeared on the scene, it had its rapid growth in its first 100 years, where it exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula, conquered northern Africa, made its way up into Europe and southern Russia. It became this huge geographic empire that lasted intact and until probably around the year was, I think it was in around the 1500s, was when Islam became in material decline, just at the exact same time that Europe was experiencing the Renaissance. And we see this historical phenomena whereby Europe expands its empire globally, and Islam is on the decline. And relative from the Islamic world, this was a very traumatic event where when the Europeans, who were the dhimmi, according to Islamic law, were the second-class citizen, all of a sudden were conquering them left, right, and center. It sent the Islamic world into an existential crisis. And so you have this phenomenon where Europe is expanding to the point of up to the First World War, which we covered last week. At the time of the First World War, between the United States and the European powers, they literally owned and administered about 85% of the landmass of planet Earth. And that system of colonialization, which was a 100-year trend, and which was kind of like the dot-com phenomena of that age, was go get your own colony, expand your empire through getting a colony. So that over 100 years, all the major European powers went all over the world, and in South America, in Africa, in Russia, in North America, they expanded their sovereignty through the colonial system. And that system also survived up until the First World War, which was the first major global conflict. And as we covered last week, in the part of the casualties of the First World War were the cessation of the aristocratic sovereign control over the affairs of mankind. Going into the First World War, kings and queens and czars, etc., they actually were still sovereign powers. 4 years later, on the other side of the First World War, they no longer had that legal right. And what we had on the other side of the First World War was the advanced nations, the advanced democratic nations, which were the Allied forces in general, but Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States, which these were the leading cultures that were now defining the course, the destiny, if you will, just as a function of the expression of their of their understanding the world expressed through their culture, but they were the ones who were now setting the rules for mankind. And so, historically speaking, what happened at that point was the rules of history changed. And so you have the Western, so literally at the end of the Second World War, the Allied powers, legally speaking, owned.
Let me just ask a question.
Sure.
If we could bring Gerard on, because you hit on some very important points. Denial of our history, religious basis for our denial. There's going on right now a campaign being waged by BDS groups, let's say, other groups too, against the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And it's some kind of a concoction they have come up with to deny the Jewish people the right to sovereignty in the land of Israel, what our historic rights are. But the IRA definition is so basic to reality. So I'm just wondering, Gerard, when you're in the courtroom and you have this definition, IRA definition, what are you facing? How does that work in with this delegitimization campaign of our basic rights to that little tiny speck of land in the Middle East that these modern day Nazis find insulting to them?
Well, I think the issue where it is unique in many respects, more unique about it than other definitions or other ways of looking, is that it addresses anti-Zionism. It addresses the connection that Jews feel as an essential part of and it brings to the fore the issue to be critical of government policies, to attack an entire people and their belief in a national homeland. So I think it's important, and it's very critical to understanding what am. Because today it's not about, but it's no longer manifested in or in defacing the door of a foul language. It's become an identity on Zionist identity, on the connection. So that is what modern anti-Semitism definition goes a long way to addressing that. People who oppose Israel and who oppose out to destroy Jewish identity, they latch on this and well, this means this is an attack on our freedom of speech, X, Y, and Z. But here's the issue. We'll say whatever we want to say. The IRA definition towards establishing consequences, conduct, and that conduct hurts the Jewish community. In today's society, there are some words you can't use. Editor who was fired for using a word that 20 years ago was frequently. We've come to accept that you can't use terms to refer to minority communities offensive to those people. But with the Jewish folk, you can say and get away with consequences. So where the IRA definition comes, what anti-Semitism looks like, doesn't tell people you can't use those words. I can go out and use something that's offensive to any minority I choose to speech. But when it starts to hurt people, to conduct an action that affects people, that's prohibited. And the IRA definition goes a long way to what constitutes those words. So it's not making, IRA definition does not make Israel. It does not make it illegal to say bad, but it puts people on notice the sorts of things the Jewish community and their identity, words turn into action, they're actionable.
Absolutely. We see these, I mean, I'd make a parallel with these BDS leaders that are calling for the annihilation of Israel on the same wavelength as Nazi lawyers from years ago denying the Jewish people their right to exist.
Well, as a matter of fact, it was the Nazi movement and the Islamic movement. The reason they allied them. This is a little unknown fact of history, but that the Nazis were enamored with Islam, and Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was a welcome member of Hitler's court in Berlin. And he mentored them in the tenets of Islam. And so the two kind of losing sides after the First World War were Germany. It was the alliance was between the Ottoman Empire, Germany, and the Austrian Empire. So in the conflict of the First World War, it was the Allied nations against the German, Austrians, and the Muslims. So the losing side in the First World War were the Muslims and the Germans. And Nazism was it was an attempted repudiation of Versailles, of the Versailles Treaty. And so what Hitler attempted to do was he threw off all the obligations that were incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles and just said none of that applies anymore. And there's this new game in town called Nazism that's going to be a 1,000-year Reich. And here are the rules. And they literally invented a Nazi ideology along the way. And they were aligned with Islam. As a matter of fact, the first genocide, which was the Armenian Genocide, this is not metaphorically, literally, the Germans were observers of the Armenian Islamic genocide. Their idea, the concept of a genocide, of wiping out a people, they learned that from the Muslims. They industrialized it, and they brought their German industrial expertise to the process. But the notion of it, they learned from the Muslims. And so, and in addition to that, literally, after the war ended, Nazi officers made their way to the Middle East and began advising the heads of Arab states on all sorts of military and other diplomatic issues. So it's not, when we say Islamofascist Nazis, we kind of think it's metaphorical. There are actual direct links between the Nazis and the Muslim Brotherhoods. They mentored and taught each other, and their objectives are the same as well. They have that they come from a different motivational set. Whereas the Nazis was just pure, unadulterated hatred for no reason. In the Islamic world, the hatred is based on, the denial of Muhammad as the prophet, and also the fact that in the Islamic world, they see Israel as Dar al-Islam. So they believe that they're invoked with this divine mission to reconquer it, because it was for 1,000 years, it was under Islamic administration. And from their side, the fundamentalists, and by the way, there's a comment here about the Islamic world. I'm talking about fundamental Islam. I'm not talking how modern Islam is expressed. There's, within the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world today, there's different kind of expressions of fidelity. There's the hardcore group, which are kind of like the Ayatollahs and the Hamases of the world, and the Osama bin Ladens of the world, which only represent about 20% of the Islamic world, but that's 300 million people. The others are more moderate. They are more westernized. They're more acclimatized. So just to answer that comment, I'm speaking fundamentally speaking. There's about 300 million people, estimate, 200 to 300 million people in the Islamic world that do believe these fundamental. They're the ones who do strap the bombs onto their kids. They're the ones, the Ayatollahs, they're building nuclear weapons because they actually do want to wipe out Israel. They believe it's a divine mitzvah, it's a commandment from Allah to do such a thing. So it's that hardcore belief system, which is what we see expressed in modern times. So the BDS, which is an expression of that ideology. and it's the diplomatic expression, but it's just according to their belief system, they're allowed to lie. It's within their treaties to the dhimmi, which are Christian and Jews, or to the harbi, the disbeliever. Lying is it's a merit to achieve the jihad. And so we look at it as Westerners, we're going like, hey, that's not fair. You should be telling the truth. You don't know peace. It's just they're literally different belief systems. And if you don't understand the differences in the belief systems, you'll constantly misinterpret what's going on. And certainly from a position of foreign policy, and this is where the Israeli government themselves, when they enter into these peace, first of all, they legitimize the so-called Palestinians because they themselves, they don't understand their rights in international law, Israeli constitutional law, in Torah law. They're almost pragmatists, if you will. Their Zionist philosophy is not rooted in deep systems of law, or it has flavorings, we'll call it. But they also ignore certain fundamentals, and so they come more from a very humanistic perspective, right? The communism and all the things that communism offers to an individual as they navigate their way through the material world. So the Israeli government, it's as a consequence of actually not understanding the belief system of Islam or their own rights in halakha, in international law, in Israeli constitutional law, they have allowed this cancer, if you will, to metastasize and take on its current form. And it's kind of like, it's a difference, when using the metaphor of cancer, right? There's a school of thought. One school of thought is, there's a war on cancer. We got to use surgery and allopathic pharmacy, medicines, pharmacological medicines to kill the cancer. That's one school of thought. There's another school of thought, which is that cancer is actually a healing mechanism of the body. When the body gets very toxic, the body has its prime operative is to survive. So when it is because of a person's, could be genetics or environmental or lifestyle habits, but when the body becomes too toxic, the body aggregates those cells into a tumor because it's kind of like, compartmentalizing it. And if you actually work with the body to strengthen its own healing systems, then you heal the cancer. And there's therapeutics that treat cancer that way. So it depends how you define, the disease, if you will. And I think in our case, to really understand, I think to wage a war on BDS without understanding the motives behind it, what's really the deeper level behind it, and just trying to play whack-a-mole with them, try and throw Western logic at them, and they throw it back at us. That's a fool's errand. You really have to go right to the root of the matter, and redefine the playing field, and you put it in the context of real truth, like real legal truth and real historical truth, and once you know these fundamentals, you can actually undo their logic very easily. And you totally expose them. And I think I shared this on what BDS, and first of all, there is literally no such thing in history as the Palestinian people. There never was, ever. There's no such thing. The Arabs who lived in mandated Palestine, they actually had sovereign legal rights. The ones who actually lived there, when the mandate was issued in San Remo, those Arabs who lived there under the mandate, they had sovereign rights, as well as the Jews. What was unique about the mandate for Palestine, it not only gave sovereign rights to the Jews who were living in Palestine, which was Palestine also in the context of international law, was literally a legal country created by the Supreme Allied Council. That's where Palestine comes from. It was giving nods to certain historical events when the Romans conquered the Second Temple and they renamed it Syria Palestina. I think that's where the name came from. But in modern contemporary law, the region of Palestine was created by the Supreme Allied Council. That happened on April 24th, 1920. The country of Palestine was created, legally speaking, by the Supreme Allied Council. So the Arabs who lived in Palestine they were beneficiaries for the Mandate for Palestine. It wasn't only Jews who had gained rights. Jews gained the sovereign right to create a nation state, and there was certain rights given to Jews who lived outside of Israel to come to Israel and create a nation state. But Arabs and Christians and Muslims who was ever living there, they had rights when the time came when the mandate turned into a sovereign state. So in 1948, when May 14th, 1948, when David Ben-Gurion declared the state, and the legal foundation by which he declared the state stemmed from San Remo and the San Remo Resolution, the Mandate for Palestine, the various treaties that came out of the San Remo Peace Conference, those Arabs who were living in Palestine became citizens of the State of Israel. What they decided to do with their new citizenship on the very first day of becoming newly minted Israeli citizens was to commit treason. And they sided with the 5 invading Arab armies whose mission was to wipe out the newly formed state, which was also completely illegal against UN, the new Charter of the United Nations, to do all these things. They were all of it was illegal. So under the lens of the truth of the law, those Arabs who call themselves Palestinians, they've invented a whole identity for themselves that they're the original indigenous people that go back, the time before Abraham, and all their lies that they told, and they make up the narrative. Who they actually really are is they are treasonous citizens of the State of Israel, who under Israeli constitutional law, the punishment for treason is the death penalty or life imprisonment. Anybody who commits treason against the state, who materially aids and abets an enemy to undermine the sovereign control of the legitimate sovereign in Israeli constitutional law, never mind internationally, in Israeli constitutional law, that is what they become subject to, that penalty. So, and unfortunately, because
let me ask you about Henry. Let me ask you about that, and Gerard could chime in also on this. But so you have this event every year. They call it Nakba Day.
Yes.
Like they just don't acknowledge what took place in 47, 48. They don't acknowledge it at all.
Yes.
Unless, have you heard it from any of these BDS and radical Islamic organizations that they recognize the reality of what happened in 1948?
Well, they don't, because their belief in Islam does not allow them to accept that the political and the de facto reality. Their belief is that what we call Israel / Palestine, they call Dar al-Islam. It is part of the greater Ummah of Islamic lands. And by Islamic law, they are not allowed to acknowledge, but it'd be akin to asking a B'nai Israel to eat a pork and cheese sandwich on Yom Kippur. Like, that's how the gravity of the sin from their spiritual belief system to acknowledge that Israel is actually an independent sovereign state. It's not Dar al-Islam. That is what you are, spiritually speaking, asking them to submit to, and they can't. The fundamentalists can't. Other ones who are more moderate, obviously they can. I'm saying, fundamentally speaking, that group in the Islamic world who clings to these fundamental tenets, you're asking them to do something impossible. And as a matter of fact, in the context of the sovereign legal rights, there is a way around that. That's a different discussion. But to impose this belief system on that, that's there's no possible they can never agree to that. And so the Nakba for them it's relative from the Islamic point of view, it is a Nakba because they lost sovereign control of Dar al-Islam. And so, and not only that, the new identity and the strategy, the diplomatic strategy of inventing the identity of the Palestinian people and using the diplomatic instruments of the UN, etc., that's all in clear adherence to Islamic Sharia law. They're being faithful, and they're keeping the fidelity of Islam. And so there can never be the two-state solution and all the solutions of Western nations. Just give them some money and build them some schools and give them some roads and give them their own state. And, all the things that seem so normal to us, it is fundamentally impossible for them. So if the real solution is, and this is part of, as in addition, our mission of reintroducing the true facts of law and history back into the diplomatic dialogue. In other words, not necessarily for the Islamic world, certain elements, but the fundamentalists, they're never going to accept any of this anyway. They don't accept defeat in the First World War. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire. In their view of history, it's a temporary situation.
Temporary setback.
It's a temporary setback, and they have an infinite time scale to rectify it. And so, and you have to in a serious way. First of all, in the Islamic world, there are models like the Abraham Accords. I think you're seeing those are moderate Islamic leaders. They do understand the law different. There's a reform in their belief systems. That's why they were actually able to enter into these diplomatic arrangements. And even within Islamic worldview, they actually acknowledge that the land of Israel does belong to Bnei Israel. Their scholars say that. So I'm saying, but there's a belief system that doesn't believe that, a certain segment that doesn't believe that. And so that's kind of the Sunni and the Sunni and the Shia split. There's differences in ideologies within their own internal conflict. So, but the way to resolve that issue, and this is part from our side, as I've thought through. So there's, in our mission, the mission of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, to go to the nations of the world and say, like, look, the resolution here is just to obey the actual laws that exist. These are treaties that you're all signatories to. This is basic, fundamental international law. You can't actually, if you attempt to undo our rights, you're going to undo all the rights of the Arab states that were created post-World War I. You'll undo the rights of Iraq. You'll undo the rights of Syria. You'll undo the rights of Lebanon. You can't just undo one without undoing the other. And so there's the exercise of recalibrating the discussion back to the true facts of law and history. And then we can say, okay, that's the roadmap. These are the laws. These historical facts. And then to deal with the facts on the ground. So that there are millions of Arabs living in Israel. So what do you do with them? What do you do with their ideology or their belief systems, etc.? So, that's the way that I have thought around that. And not only that, there's even within the Jewish community, there's halachic issues. Certainly by halakha, you're not allowed to cede an inch of Eretz Israel. I think the only condition under halakha in which you can cede Eretz Israel, like sovereign, the land itself, is in a matter of peace, but it has to be for real peace. Mm-hmm. Until Zman HaMashiach, there's some flexibility around that, but it has to be. It's not a determination of political leaders; it's a determination from military leaders. In other words, they have to make, yes, this fundamentally makes the people who are living in the land safer, and the halacha allows for that peace to take place under that condition.
Right.
So within those systems, to address everybody's needs at the table, kind of the more contemporary, we'll call secular modern law, international law, modern Israeli constitutional law, halacha and Sharia law, there is a solution around that, and So and the solution looks something like this. So for the broad international community, they acknowledge the treaties that were signed after World War I and the mandate for Palestine, and that de jure sovereign legal rights were vested in the Jewish people, and they're the sovereign over Palestine. End of the story. That's That's the long and the short of it. So we're the sovereign. There's not two equal competing parties who both have 50-50 legitimate claims, and who's right. That has been clearly decided in San Remo. So we, the political leadership of the state of Israel, have to go back to the nations of the world and remind them of that. And all the signatories, it should be in their parliaments. They have to reconfirm all those rights. There are laws that exist within the nation states of all the signatories from the Supreme Allied Council. It's Italian national laws, British national laws, French national laws, U.S. national laws, Japanese national law. Every member of the League of Nations, United Nations, when they signed those treaties, they accepted these laws. So we go back and we remind them that, hey, these are the laws. And so that kind of, that deconstructs, the entire investment that the Palestinian movement made to attempt to convince the diplomatic world that there's another version of reality. So we take that narrative, we show that narrative in the dustbin of history. But then, what do we do de facto? So my solution would be as follows. Places where there are, so we have, we live in the great country of Canada, and certainly in the United States, they have 50 states, and we have 10 provinces and 2 territories. So you have federal law and you have provincial law. And you have national law and you have state law. So there's no reason why the nation state of Israel can't go to Ramla or Gaza and make that into a province. Ramla becomes a province of the state of Israel. And they can have their own they look just like in the province of Ontario. We have the Premier of Ontario and we have mayors of city, and there's a whole system of governance. They can have all of that. The sovereign is still the state of Israel, but they get to have their self-sovereignty in the province of Gaza or the province of Ramallah, whatever those territories are, and they get to self-actualize as citizens of the states. Wouldn't happen overnight. There would have to be a cooling off period just because there's been a lot of radicalization, but from a lawful legal way, that's how you give them, within the context of modern law, you give them that sense of self-government. And in terms of demilitarizing, we know in places like London, their police force, their London bobbies, they don't walk around with guns. It's only the British Army that has the guns. But their police force, they have batons, they bop people on the head, but they can police their streets. They don't need to be armed.
Okay, so let me ask you. So with that, with our legal rights, all that, is enough being done in the Jewish community to educate, in your opinion, in both of your opinions, to educate the Jewish community, Jewish students, on our legal rights, our sovereign rights, all this? Are they given the tools? Do we have enough educators that are really doing the job in the community, in our communities throughout the world, Jewish communities in the United States, various cities, and in Canada? In your opinion, do you see that happening?
The short answer is no. And there are, the legal scholarship, the clarification of the rights took place in 2008. The co-occurring events. There were 2 Canadian lawyers. One's named Howard Grief, and the other's name is Jacques Gauthier.
Right.
They were the ones who published actual scholarly works that clarified all these issues. They kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together legally and historically speaking, and definitively clarified it. And it's really been only since 2008 that this new narrative, the old narrative, but the relatively new narrative in a diplomatic sense, led by a few educated people. I'm one of them, and there's a number of individuals in Toronto who and also in the U.S. and some also in Europe who have begun the process. Now, the Lawfare Project is now leading that process and putting together not only the educational materials to educate at a mass level, but also the materials to meet with political leaders and to educate them as well. In addition to the fact that, that but the politics are complicated. Like even in Israel, right? Israel has 40 political parties. I mean, it's only Labor and Likud that seem to be the only party, but there is 40 political parties in a country of 9 million people. A lot of that is very left-leaning, and they've been indoctrinated into some very left-leaning liberal principles. So the communal politics is a challenge. But I think now that we have social media and all sorts of tools that we can be having seminars, online seminars, creating videos, there's books available. That process is now beginning, but it definitely needs to be amped up, and the Lawfare Project is taking a lead with that at the mass level. And our tactics are to mass educate the political leadership, but also to use courts of law as a way to assert the rights.
No, but I understand that. I get that you have to go to court, and I mean, it's in the name too, the Lawfare Project. But so you want to reach the community as much as you can. So is the Lawfare Project, what their advocacy, at least in terms of reaching out to the community and educating the community, aside from the legal work, are they getting the support they need from, let's say, the UJA, let's say in Canada, CJA, let's say in the United States, I don't know, AIPAC or other major Jewish organizations in the United States? Is that happening to really reach out to the community? Because I could tell you, you have in the United States J Street that is working on the campus, targeting Jewish students to work against Israel. And you have here in Canada, J Space, which is pretty much the same thing as J Street, reaching out to Jewish students, and it's not good. I mean, they're speaking out against the Jewish National Fund, and it's almost like they're legitimizing the PA when the PA says it's the death penalty for an Arab to sell, or a quote Palestinian to sell land to Jews. So we need, not as a counter to what J Street and J Space are doing, but this is the way, and we have to just be as upfront as possible with our community to educate them, with our rabbanim, our rabbis, and educators, with the full support of major Jewish organizations to get that across, that it shouldn't be a struggle. Is that going on?
It is, and so I would, and it's actually now gaining momentum now. I would say, since actually the spring of this year, like the efforts of the Lawfare Project, and Gerard has begun to publish, in magazines like Newsweek. We had just in our own, this past April 24th was the 100th year anniversary of San Remo. And so as an institution, we put out our first public acknowledgement of San Remo and the sovereign legal rights. And that connected us to other individuals, to other think tanks around the world who are also deeply involved with the issue. There are a lot of very serious legal scholars who are deeply involved in the issue. And I would say, yes, over the past 6 months, over the past, well, it's more than that now, it's 10 months, things have accelerated, and they are accelerating now, yes. And we're putting together educational materials, we're putting together our advisory group, our legal advisory group. We're kind of firing on all cylinders. And so things are, it has been up from 2008 till now, so to speak, we'll call it heavy slogging. And now I'll call it things are beginning to accelerate.
Right. Okay, well, listen, we've been on for a while. I think mean, there's we touched on a lot of issues. There's so much to touch on. There's so much to talk about because the attack is so ferocious on our rights to exist.
Yes.
So there's so much. I mean, we're going to be on next week, the week after, and Passover is coming up. I mean, you know, it's in our blood, it's in our tradition, our whole rights.
Yes.
You know, just when we sit down at the Seder for
Yes.
Passover, we talk about leaving Egypt, going to Israel.
Yes.
It's so basic, and yet we have this denial of our rights. And you know, part of it, I think, is because the overall Arab world or Islamic world, they look at the Jewish people, a foreign implant in an Islamic sea. And who
Yes.
are we to even say anything?
Yes.
We're like a little tiny ant looking up to a giant in terms of numbers.
I would qualify this saying that there's about 20% of the community is very hardened in that view. Unfortunately, that's 20% of 1.6 billion people. So
Right.
that's a large number of people.
Mhm.
But 80% is not hardened. Like there is a more moderate, flexible, reforming side of Islam. Islam itself is going through.
Well, I don't know. It froze there on Henry. Any final words here, Gerard? Can you?
Well, I will say, first of all, thank you for having us on. It's really been an
Yes.
honor, and we really appreciate everything that you do in educating the community. And I think education is key. Taking it back to BDS, why do we have these problems today is one of the biggest problems is a lack of education on what history and the law is. People don't understand Jewish sovereign rights to Israel. People don't understand Jewish history. People don't understand Jewish identity. Instead, we're living with an atmosphere where groups like BDS come in and insert themselves, and their view is the only one that's heard. Therefore, their view must be the correct one. Now, you mentioned before Nakba Day. You know what I think of when I hear that? I think of Nathan Bedford Forrest Day. He was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, yet people still celebrate him because they have this perverse view of history where they deny what actually happened because they never learn about it. They learn about their own reality from people who don't know what history is. And that's the same problem that we're dealing with in the Jewish community. We are targeted by people who are educating today's youth, tomorrow's leaders, in a version of history that has no basis in reality, where you have martyrs who never existed, where you have oppression that does not exist. The only oppression is the oppression of academics today who go after the Jewish community, the oppression of BDS, the oppression of groups that fund foreign terrorists to come to our campuses and lecture our students about myths and fallacies. So how do we combat this? Well, one thing we do is combat it on a legal front. But the other thing that we have to do is we have to come together as a community and educate our kids on what the truth is. And this starts at home, this starts at temple, and this starts by pushing people on college campuses to invite speakers who can speak the truth, so that you don't have one version of reality, which is a false one, which is the BDS version, but instead kids learn what the truth is. And the truth is a rich and vibrant history and culture of the Jewish people that should not and cannot be continually oppressed by misinformed people who want to do evil.
One other aspect that has to be brought into it, and I have seen it, I've been involved with this, that I think has led to some success. For instance, when Charities Canada invited some former IDF soldiers to speak at York University, the BDS, they made it clear that they're going to try to shut it down. Now, I've done some research that in other countries on campuses, the same type of event has gone on and was shut down. A few days before the one at York University in London, England, 2 events were shut down at various campuses. In the United States, that occurred. Netanyahu, a number of years ago, wanted to speak in Montreal at Concordia University. That was shut down. In Toronto at York University, we mobilized the community to say never again. They're not shutting it down. And we showed emotion on campus. And I think that's one thing that really has to happen, that the community, in terms of, one, we have to use all our legal resources to the best of our capabilities with great people like yourself to do this. And brains like Erwin Kotler, and his daughter's a Knesset member. I mean, she's brilliant. What she says and how she speaks about international law, it's unbelievable. We have talent in the community. And we have educators, and they have to do their job and get it out there to the masses in our community, what the truth is, what reality is. Not as a mechanism necessarily to defend ourselves, but really, I mean, it's the truth. This is what we're all about. So it has to be so natural to present the truth to the Jewish community, what our rights are as Jews and legal rights, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, because we're right. And I guess this goes back to last week's Parsha with Moses, that he just, he's not mentioned in the Parsha, but he really is mentioned because he's the ultimate leader, that he's the humblest of Jews that we know of in our history as a leader. But he took the stand. He took the ultimate stand. And you have to take the stand. You have to show passion. And you got to be there on the campus or wherever they are. If it's Nakba Day, publicly, downtown Toronto, downtown New York, downtown wherever, big spectacle, or on campus, major spectacle, Israeli Apartheid Week. You got to show your passion, your commitment, and stand up to the hate and stand up to this anti-Semitism and get the students out. And we're right, and we're not backing down. And then we'll be more successful, and everything comes together. I'm not saying we have to go out there and we have to fight. We have to stand up, or the students have to. So they're counting on our lawyers to use their talents. They're counting on our educators. We also have to have that positive emotion in our community to stand up and get indignant about this anti-Semitism because it's so vile.
Is Gerard? Are you?
He's trying to say something.
Can you hear us, Gerard? No, I think we lost the connection there. So, Meir, I think you're
Gerard, can you hear us?
Got to check out this platform. So,
Okay.
So Meir, I think you're correct. It's different. There's different individuals who have different roles to play. There are certain fundamental facts that do need to be reseated back into the how I give it. I said, we do need to recalibrate the dialogue back to the true facts of law and history. That we can't move away from that. Those new laws, and these are a major historic turning points for humanity.
Yes.
So we can't, we have to return back to mankind their true memories about themselves. We were a player, but these are, BDS and the Palestinian, view of the world is a complete denial of the truth. So by us asserting our sovereign legal rights, we actually the net benefit is we return mankind back to their true memories as well.
I think Gerard could say something now. I think it turned on. Gerard, can you hear us? There's some technical issue.
Gerard?
Something with the speaker. Anyways, listen, it's been great having you both on. Thank you very much. It's past 9, so it's been over an hour and a half. It's great. This information is vital for our people. Thank you very much. Shalom, shalom. We'll have you on more often. and we'll get the word out, and we'll accomplish on every level.
Fantastic.
We'll go from strength to strength. So should God bless both of you for joining us, and thank you very much. And
I'd
our,
like to
here in
make a
the
closing
studio.
comment. My closing comment is my opinion and
Yes.
regarding BDS. And best way to do it, I think, always feel that a picture kind of is worth 1,000 words. So here's our closing picture.
Okay. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Buy Israeli. Buy, donate, and support.
Yes, exactly.
That's the BDS.
That's the BDS we all like. And okay, I'll see if our closing video is going to play. I'll figure out for next week while we had some video problems here in the studio because we're many thousands of miles away. But here we go. Let's see if this is going to work.
Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Israel